Okay, getting on with our 4-stroke 5-event cycle engine. So in the part 1 of this is our part 2. But in part 1, of course, we got introduced to the 4-stroke 5-event cycle engine. And we talked, of course, mainly about that intake event and the exhaust event. So we talked about our valve overlaps and volumetric efficiency and that stuff. So in this one, we're going to talk a little bit more, continue about those events. So we get into the compression and the ignition in those. The compression event, of course, that's pretty self-explanatory, where we hit bottom center as we're heading into that second stroke, and we begin to compress that fuel-air mixture that we've drawn into the cylinder. And the amount of compression that we do have, we have the terms low compression and high compression engines, makes a difference, with what type of fuel we can burn, and depending on where we got the low compression or high compression. Typically, you can tell what kind of compression ratio, and we'll talk more about compression ratios in another lesson, but you can tell what kind of compression ratios you have, mainly by what's the minimum octane of fuel that's available for that engine. So in our aircraft engines, we had what we called a grade 80 fuel, the red-colored gasoline years ago, that was designed for the low compression. And we've pretty much phased out those fuels, and so now all the engines being produced are considered a high compression engine. Typically in the range of about 9 to 1, if for those of you that know anything about compression ratio, like I said, we'll get to that a little bit later. So the compression event's pretty self-explanatory. We've got both our valves are closed, and we're compressing that fuel-air mixture. Then we're ready for the ignition event, and let's make sure you can see my little diagram here. I think so. You should be able to see that pretty good. Okay, so here's back to the same cylinder where I have drawn in my fuel-air mixture in here. And then, of course, our aircraft engines, we do have 2 spark plugs. We got a spark plug on each side of the cylinder, which, of course, those of you who have become familiar with the engines a little bit, you got 2 magnetos on the engine, and each magneto fires 1 spark plug in each cylinder. But the ignition event here is important, basically because this spark plug is getting ignite, and this one's getting ignite, and then you're going to start to get a flame front propagation coming from each side over here, as that flame front propagates to completely consume all that fuel-air mixture in the cylinder. Then the idea is it's supposed to, as that piston's coming up and you're compressing and we're igniting that thing, it's going to build up the pressure, and you do want that propagation and building. So as the piston's coming up in the cylinder, we're going to ignite it, and as it continues up through top center and then it's heading into the power stroke or your power event, then it still keeps propagating, and the idea is for it to smoothly push that piston down in the cylinder. And you want that to build up to the best pressure when the connecting rod has the best angle or mechanical advantage onto the crankshaft to drive that down, the crankshaft around down into that power stroke. And so this is also a good graphic here. We know we'll have you out in the shop, and one of the things we will have done probably by the time you're watching this video, you've already probably been in the shop, and when we ran the engines, we did a magneto test where we basically, you got your 2 magnetos, you're shutting off one of the magnetos, leaving just one running, so you're leaving just 1 spark plug sparking in each cylinder. And the other thing we'll notice, what we were looking for there was when we do shut off 1 magneto, we're looking for an appropriate, say about 50 RPM loss, indicating we're actually producing a little bit less horsepower because now we have less RPM. And what's going on there is, since we've shut off 1 spark plug, so we've got just one over here that's igniting this, So this fuel-air mixture, this guy has to go over and do this guy's side of the burning. And so we've essentially retarded the timing of the burn. And so that's why we see an RPM loss when we do shut off a magneto, is because this guy's having to go over and do this guy's work that he did. So it's happening late. So that's what we call a retarded timing event going on there. And that's what we should see. And we should see that when we turn off this one, turn this one on. We should see the same thing happening. Or now this guy has to go over and consume this guy's half of it as well too. There's another term we're going to introduce you to that is a bad thing that can happen in cylinders. So there's two terms. There's preignition and detonation. Preignition is a kind of self-explanatory in that preignition is when this fuel-air mixture gets ignited before the spark plug lights it. So there's some test questions that talk about why on a valve on this edge over here you would never grind that down to what's called a sharp or feathered edge, because a feathered edge valve can actually kind of get incandescent into the cylinder and ignite the fuel air mixture, that's what we call preignition. Preignition can also occur if I were to put that grade 80, the low compression fuel, into a high compression engine. It can ignite much like a diesel engine would ignite the fuel in a diesel engine. And so, so preignition is the igniting of the fuel air mixture before the spark plugs light it. Now, the term detonation, where I mentioned a minute ago, where you should have a nice, even flame front propagation going on here, when a fuel air mixture gets into detonation, it then has an instantaneous release of energy. So I don't have the nice building up to pressure and waiting for the piston to head down that power stroke to have the best mechanical, when that pressure builds up to the highest pressure there. So it might start off propagating normally, but as that compression was happening and putting more pressure on it, then it can get off into that detonation. So detonation definition is the uncontrolled burning of the fuel air mixture. And you tend to get a hammering effect. So rather than a nice smooth push on the piston, you get a bam onto the piston, and it can actually blow holes into a piston and things like that. So when you have too much heat, too much pressure, or the wrong fuel, it can get off into detonation. You can actually see on pistons when they come out of an engine what's going on flame-wise up here on top of the piston, and kind of see what's going on with the cylinder. We have one engine of our aircraft out here, we found that it had a white color on top of the piston up here. It was all white, indicating that we were running really lean, and also we failed on a compression check. You could stick your fingernail in between the ring and the ringland groove here, indicating there was a lot of wear going on here. And this engine only had 400 hours on it, and what we had found, it was going off, it was all, you could see the symptoms up here, and you get to see that piston when we get out into the shop, where it had been going off into detonation. So it started off with some preignition, got off into detonation, and basically beat the pistons in that thing when it was having that partial detonation. And what it came from was the students had found they got a little more horsepower out of the engine when they leaned it. And so instead of having a nice rich, and we'll talk more about fuel air mixtures later, but instead of having the nice rich fuel air mixture to help with the cooling in the cylinder, they were leaning out that mixture on takeoff excessively, and was having the engine get off into detonation. It was kind of a shame too, is that, like I said, was a 2,400-hour engine that was basically wore out at 400 hours. So they were of course doing that during the summertime, and because you have that hot air out there, it's less dense, so you're not getting the horsepower. So they were doing everything they could to try and get that horsepower back by leaning it on the takeoff power and taking away that what's called power enrichment fuel. Okay, so we have our intake event, we have our compression event, talked about that, and then of course the ignition event that's occurring there, and talk about that. It should be a nice, even, propagating flame front that expands that piston down into the cylinder rather than driving it, and like what detonation would occur. And we pretty much covered the exhaust event already, and how the exhaust event basically leads into the intake event and so on. Okay, where are we at on our time? Okay, I think we'll call that good.